Okay, so let's start on chapter 6. So we're going to cover this chapter first, and then we'll go back to do pure cultures and selective differential media, because I want that more to align with what we're doing in lab in a couple of weeks. So that's why we're starting with this chapter. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here is microbial growth, and we're going to focus on bacteria, because bacteria cause most infections that we're going to talk about, and viruses replicate completely independently of bacteria, so we'll talk about them in their own chapter. So we're just going to talk about how, organisms grow in general, and then we're going to move on to bacteria specifically. So a couple of terms that I want you to know. It has to do with where we get our carbon sources from. And we need to, most organisms need to ingest carbon that they can use in their metabolism from an outside source. And those are what we refer to as heterotrophs. So heterotrophs have to obtain their carbon in organic form. For example, all of the things, the classes that we talked about in chapter 2, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, etc. A heterotroph means that they have to get that from an external source. And so that makes them nutritionally dependent on other living things, okay? Or, non-living things. So all of the organisms that we are going to study in this class are heterotrophs. And you are a heterotroph, right? You have to eat, okay? Or you're going to starve to death and eventually you will not be around. So you also are a heterotroph. The autotrophs are the ones that, like plants and algae that can harness light and basically make their own nutrition. So, they don't need anyone, and therefore, in microorganism speak, they can't cause infections, right? Because infections are produced by organisms that grow in and on us, and that are pathogenic, and so they're basically, using our nutrition or basically eating us to reproduce themselves, okay? So all of the organisms we're going to talk about are heterotrophs. I also want to define a couple of terms in terms of parasites, and we'll do our own parasite chapter on the larger parasites, but I just want to give you a couple of definitions. Okay, so the definition of a parasite is an organism that lives completely at the expense of another organism. Okay, so not only does it, steal nutrition, but it basically causes damage. Okay, so the parasite doesn't do anything good for the host. It uses all of its nutrition to allow it to grow. So we can think of even, usually when people think of parasites, they're like, ooh, tapeworms and, giardia and things like that. But really, bacteria and even viruses are parasites too, right? Because they are either living or replicating completely at our expense. So all of the pathogenic organisms that we talk about in this class really are parasites. A couple of definitions that have to do with parasites. So ectoparasites live on the body. Okay, so for example, types of lice. Okay, those are obviously parasites, but they're living on the outside. Endoparasites are inside us, so they're living in organs and tissues. So think of a tapeworm that's in your intestines. That would be an endoparasite. Also, the malaria parasite that lives within our red blood cells. Intracellular parasites means parasites that can only reproduce when they are inside a cell. So you can have parasites that live within cells, like I mentioned, the malaria parasite is one, but also viruses would fit into this category too. Now, granted, they're not living within your cells, they're simply replicating within your cells. But viruses, unless they can make it into the cell that they're, genetically programmed to target, they don't do any harm. But once they get inside, then you have a problem. So intracellular means inside a cell. And then the term obligate. So obligate means you're obliged to do it or you have to do it. So there are certain organisms that are what we call obligate parasites, meaning that if they are not, inside an organism or on an organism or within their cells, they cannot replicate and they can't grow. So basically, they're not free living. They have to be stealing nutrition from a host to be able to, propagate their life cycle. And that's what we refer to as obligate parasites. So I now want to move on to talking about environmental factors that influence microbes. And you're actually going to do a lab on this, okay, a little later on in the semester. So when that lab comes around, I'm going to refer you back to this PowerPoint and to this lecture. So we're going to talk about temperature. We're going to talk about oxygen, a little bit about pH, and then also osmotic pressure. So one of the things that affects how organisms, and I'm specifically going to talk about bacteria here because that's what we're going to deal with in lab, is the temperature at which they grow. So remember, bacteria don't have, a system for homeostasis. So they're going to grow at whatever host temperature or environmental temperature suits them best. The term that we use to talk about that is this term ambient. Ambient just means the temperature of the immediate surroundings. Okay, so for every bacterial species, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this, each bacterial species kind of has its own preferences in terms of temperature. Okay, and I like to think of it like the three bears. Okay, so each organism, each bacterial species has a minimum temperature, meaning this is the lowest temperature that it can still be able to grow. It's not going to grow very fast, but it can still maintain a little bit of growth. Okay, on the opposite end of the extreme is the maximum temperature, and this is the absolute hottest it can get and for growth to still proceed. Okay, also the amount of growth is not going to be very big, but still a little bit. And then if you exceed that temperature, then all bets are off. You're going to have proteins being denatured and the bacteria is going to die. And then finally, we have the optimum temperature. Okay, so like this is Papa Bear, this is Mama Bear, and this is Baby Bear, where everything is just right. So each bacterial species has an optimum temperature where it loves that temperature, and this is where it's going to grow the fastest and where it's going to be happiest. And guess what? Surprise, surprise, most bacteria that are human pathogens, their optimum temperature is our body temperature. Okay, so about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. So it's kind of like a little fingerprint. So some microbes have a very narrow range while others have a broad one, but each species of bacteria is going to have a minimum, a maximum, and an optimum. Okay, so actually let me forward to a couple of slides. Okay, I just want to show you this and then we'll get back to it. So, here we have a species, and you can see that, let's look at the one in the middle because that would be an example of a human pathogen. Okay, so way down here by about 15 degrees, which would be roughly, the temperature of your refrigerator, it's going to be able to grow a little bit, but just barely, not enough to cause an infection. Okay, so that's the minimum temperature. The maximum temperature, if you get above, 45 degrees Celsius, which quite honestly, the patient would be dead by then. So, you really don't have to worry about the organism growing. It's also going to be able to grow a teeny tiny little bit, but not very much. Okay. And then you have the optimum. And so look at how much this grows. This is the rate of growth, okay? So this would be an example of a human pathogen because its optimum is right about 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, and that's most human pathogens. So basically, every single bacterial species is going to show a curve like this. Now, some of them, the curve may be really narrow. Some of them, it might be much more broad. It just depends on the species. Okay, so let me go back to this. Oop, wrong way, sorry. Didn't mean to freak you out. Okay, so when we talk about temperature, there are 3 categories that we can put organisms into. So it's basically, do they like it cold, do they like it hot, or do they like it in between? And those are the 3 categories. So the first category is called a psychrophile. Now notice, it's not psycho, it's psychro. And just to point this out in terms of, words and terms and suffixes, whenever you see the suffix phile, that means loving. Okay, so I'm a caffeine phile. I'm taking lots of naps phile. That means that you love it. So a psychrophile is an organism that loves cold temperatures. And typically, a psychrophile is going to grow at, about like the temperature of your refrigerator or like the dairy case at the grocery store, okay? And so, but a lot of the psychrophiles that, for example, you might hear about a bacteria called Listeria. And Listeria is a psychrophile. It grows best in the refrigerator. However, its range of growth is so broad that it can also cause infections in humans, okay? But it grows much less in humans than it would, say, in your refrigerator, okay? So typically a psychrophile, likes it cold, may be able to grow at medium temperatures, but really prefers the cold. And then we have what we call true or obligate psychrophiles. And these are organisms that literally, if you reach 20 degrees Celsius, which is, a tiny little bit above the temperature of your refrigerator, they're not going to grow at all. Okay, so those, obviously, we don't have to worry about causing infections. But some psychrophiles, like Listeria infects refrigerated meats. Whenever you hear about some kind of outbreak that's in the dairy case or like those bagged salads, a lot of times those are psychrophiles, and they just basically pull that stuff off the shelf and incinerate it, because there's nothing you can do. Okay, so psychrophile means cold loving. Okay, now we're back to this figure. So I just want to show you that psychrophiles would be right here. Okay, so maybe a little bit of growth when it's really cold, maybe a little bit of growth when it starts getting warmer, and then here's their optimum, okay, when it's nice and cold. But Listeria, as I mentioned, has a much broader curve, and that's what allows it to also cause infections in humans at our body temperature. Okay, so that's a psychrophile. So now let's move on to mesophiles. So meso just kind of means middle. So this is an organism that grows at intermediate temperatures. So, these are organisms that can grow outside in very temperate climates like Iowa in the spring and, in the summer. And these tend to fit into categories of organisms that have optimum growth temperatures of between 20 to 40 degrees Celsius. And most of the mesophiles that infect humans have their optimum growth curves between 30 degrees and 40 degrees Celsius, which with the majority of them, the ones that really are pathogenic, have their optimum right at where human body temperature is. Okay, so going back to this is a mesophile. So you see its optimum is right at human body temperature. And then finally, we have thermophiles. And a thermophile is a bacterium that likes temperatures that are really, really hot. Okay, so a thermophile normally cannot grow below a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius. So here's one thing that'll set your mind at ease, one less thing to worry about. You will never suffer a bacterial infection by a thermophile, okay? Because if your body temperature was 50 degrees Celsius, you have much bigger problems, and quite frankly, you're in the morgue already. No one can live at that body temperature. So thermophiles like things that are really hot, and you can actually have what are called hyperthermophiles, and these grow in volcanoes. They can grow in hot vents, like Old Faithful at Yellowstone has bacteria growing in it that are hyperthermophiles. We actually take advantage of this when we talk about DNA testing, because the way that DNA testing is made really specific is because we use an enzyme from a bacteria that only grows basically in volcanoes and hot vents, and that's what allows DNA testing to be so specific. So we're very thankful for thermophiles, but you will never see them infecting one of your patients or infecting you, because they need it to be way too hot. Okay, so if we go back and look at this, here is our thermophile. So literally, they can't grow below 50 degrees Celsius, and then some of them actually go all the way up to 120 degrees, which thankfully they don't go any higher than that, because the autoclave only goes up to 121 degrees. So let's hope that no more mutations happen. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and get this uploaded, and then we're going to pick up with oxygen requirements. Okay, thanks.